Really a kind of warm-up session for the really big issue, which is General Motors, which is coming on the next few weeks. And the skirmishing between the government, the banks, the unions, and so on that you read about if you followed it, is a preparation for the much tougher negotiations with the much larger corporation, General Motors, whose impact on the economy, no matter what they do, will be much larger. For example, they're talking more about 10 to 20 or 30,000 people being laid off as part of that. And by the way, layoffs are the layoffs in the auto industry. When you cut back the auto industry, all the companies that provide inputs, you know, when you get a Chevy or a Ford, many of the things in the car are not made by Ford and Chevy. They're simply purchased by Ford and Chevy, and they stick them in there. The carburetor or the exhaust pipe or the electrical system or the cup holder or all those things in a car. So the layoffs don't count. The ones you read about in the newspaper don't count the additional tens of thousands of people who will be laid off in all the shops providing all of the inputs to this complex thing called the automobile. And obviously, since both Chrysler and General Motors are talking about massive reductions in output, that is, many fewer cars are going to be made, whole lines are gone. Pontiac is gone. I think General Motors is talking about reducing to 4 brands, Chrysler to 2, many fewer cars. There's going to be all kinds of problems in terms of repair shops, garages, and all the apparatus that supports the automobile industry. And then the irony that while the government is trying to figure out a way to salvage, quote unquote, the automobile industry of the United States, you have tens of thousands of people being laid off, and there's no way that isn't a negative. So what the government is doing to fix this industry, the way of fixing it expands the unemployment problem. The city of Detroit, which I think I mentioned to you, I visited 3 weeks ago. I went for hours and hours driving through Detroit. How many people here have ever been to Detroit? Oh, good. Some of you from Detroit? Is anyone here from? Well, that's good. Recently, have you all, those of you been there, seen it? Well, it is hard to describe. This is a place you should visit, but it'll get ready and be sure to schedule something fun later, because this is a major downer. I spent 3 hours going through West Detroit and 3 hours going through East Detroit. This is the closest thing I have seen in the United States to what I imagine Baghdad or Beirut look like. Miles and miles of broken down houses, 2, 3 houses on the block that are burnt down, 2 houses where the roofs have caved in, and then 1 house where, miraculously, there are people. And the little kids are playing in the yards next door. It's literally taking their life in their hands because a beam could come down. And then everywhere, factories that are just closed. I drove down, for those of you who know American history, I drove down to something called the River Rouge, one of the most famous, immense, I believe it's Ford that was located there, the Ford company. And you have this 5 or 6 or 7 story high rectangular building that goes on and on for 10 or 20 city blocks. All the windows are broken, no lights are on. It's just a ghost. It's like a set for a cheesy cops and robbers movie or something like that. Amazing to watch. The whole city is just. And then in the middle of this broken down city with endless miles of rubble with weeds going through what remains of the buildings. Then periodically you find little pockets of light and little pockets of activity. And most of those are fundamentalist churches of one kind or another. But you see suddenly a group of people that are actually together doing something, often dressed in what I did this on Sundays, the church day. So people were going to church. That was there. But it was in a wasteland. They were going to a church that had no buildings on either side of it, just rubble in all directions. And then in the middle of the city, what's left of the city, are a few of these tall buildings that look like a joke, like architect made a mistake and put these skyscrapers in the wrong place because it's nothing around it. It's just a little pocket of skyscrapers. And there's a museum there that people took me to, so we went to the museum. And from the museum, you can go to the 4 skyscrapers and the 11 restaurants that are right there, so that the people who fly into Detroit for a conference live in a cocoon where you can see the rubble, but you don't have to step in it because you have this little pocket. Amazing. And then we went to, on the outskirts of the city is this area where all the very wealthy people live. Grosse Point, and there's several other little points that are on either side of Grosse Point, and this point and that point. And there you can see, you know, how the people who made the decisions that produces that Detroit were able to live in an environment that didn't know anything about it. Was removed from it. Was on the water and lots of green trees and lovely gardens, and in 20 minutes you went from heaven to hell. And this city, which is already a disaster, will now become a worse disaster, since a disproportionate number of the layoffs at Chrysler, GM, Ford, and the supplying companies are all in that environment. I gave a talk at a university that's in a suburb of Detroit called Oakland University in Pontiac, Michigan. And there, all the talk of the people, I stayed in the home of a friend there, all the talk of the people in that town was that their suburb is going to be killed by this too, because many of the skilled workers are going to lose their jobs, and they live in the suburbs anyway, particularly the white ones who have run away from Detroit to get into these suburbs. The suburbs are integrated, but it's disproportionately white in the suburb, the exact opposite of the disproportionately black in the city, which is all stunningly visible. You could not ask for a more stunningly segregated city. Maybe in the north, but it's very segregated. And all of that's going to be made much worse. Anyway, let me turn then to an alternative that goes beyond hiring workers, which Europeans have always done, and which Roosevelt did, to talk about a comprehensive, different way of dealing with this. And a little bit of history, because it always sets the framework. The kinds of crisis we're going through now, as you have learned, are endemic to capitalism. Capitalism has always done this. Sometimes the crises are not so bad, sometimes they're worse. But crises, whether they're called ups and downs, or booms and busts, or business cycles, lots of words, because this is such a common phenomenon, it produces lots of words. This has always been part of capitalism. And as I told you, I think the very first day we met, anything that happens this often and that is this difficult for a society is going to you are going to be guaranteed to see there are going to have to be theories of this, and people are going to fall on two sides. Those who want to justify, excuse, rationalize this event, which on the surface is very painful for a lot of people, and those who will be very angry at the system for doing it, the two sides. The side that wants to defend or excuse has a whole host of ways of dealing with that, but by far the one that has succeeded best over the years is is that these crises are purgatives. Don't ask me to go too far with this. Think of an enema. In other words, it cleans out the system. Weak companies die, inefficient producers fade away, incompetent businessmen and women are blown out of the water. And in a sense, while it is painful, it's therapeutic. Economically speaking, it makes us better off. So you should, all of us, you and I, should look beyond the immediate pain, the discomfort, and focus ourselves on how much better we'll be, how much healthier our economy will be once we're through this periodic purging of our inefficient flotsam and jetsam that gets in our way. That really has been the major theoretical way of handling it. I could do the same thing in academic economics, but it's not necessary. It's the same basic idea. But on the other side, there have also always been people who have reacted very differently. Because we live in a society that's very fearful of debating these things, more so than most other societies, to tell you the truth, particularly more so than most developed country societies, you're probably quite familiar with what I just said in one form or another, and much less familiar with the alternative. And the alternative has been all those people who looked at this experience, this cyclical quality of capitalism, and drew from it the inference that capitalism stinks, and we should do better. That is, a system that plunges its people into this kind of up and down herky-jerky, thereby invites the criticism of it as a system and the notion that one ought to search for an alternative that might work better. And in every country on earth, more or less from country to country, theories were developed that built on this idea. Or to say the same thing another way, the socialist and communist and even other critiques of capitalism that got built up over the last 150 years always made a major point, not their only point, but a major point in their critique of capitalism was its instability. Whatever else you say about capital, and they have other critiques too, heaven knows, but one of the important critiques for all of these critical traditions was the notion that a society as unstable as this, whose social costs of this cyclical up and down are as extreme, affect so many people, last so long, that a system with this defect can and should be criticized and can and should be superseded historically. We should do something to make a system that doesn't do this to us. Probably the most famous line of this argument, I don't know who invented it first, so I can't give you a name, but the one you will encounter probably most often is an old idea which runs something like this. There's always instability in the world, including the economy, from the things human beings cannot control. What are they? Climate change, horrible storms, periods of drought. There are even things that you can write off to a kind of out-of-control set of problems, even in human communities, that take the form of war and basic conflict. Things like natural calamity, things like war, disrupt economies, plunge economies into very bad circumstances. But what capitalism introduces this argument goes is something beyond that. Capitalism doesn't just have troubles when there's a war, or it does, or when there's a natural calamity, or that'll do it. Capitalism has on top of it something built into its structure, so that whether or not there's a natural calamity and whether or not there's a political explosion, instability is brought on by its own internal mechanisms, by competition among enterprises, by the tensions and conflicts that connect employer and employee, by the conflict between the employees as a mass of people, the citizenry, and the government, which is financially dependent on the employers, but politically dependent on the employees, and how that gets worked out. These conflicts that have to do with the structure of capitalism as a system, as an economic system, impose an instability over and above, beyond that which comes from nature and that which comes, you might say, from politics. And that therefore, the socialist argument went, we can and we should do better. Okay. 100 years ago, roughly, these kinds of socialist criticisms went from the stage of ideas and even movements, social movements in the Western world, to become political parties. I already started more than 100 years ago. And they began to take power. The most famous and the earliest, again, for those of you from familiar faces, see this might be interesting to you, so let's spend a few minutes on it. The first and most important place was Germany. That is the Socialist Party of Germany, which still exists, and is a member of the governing. Germany is governed today by a coalition. That's another wonderful thing about it. In the middle of my TV and radio interviews, which I do an awful lot now, I'll make a reference to the government in Germany and the role of the socialists in it, and I can see from the other people I'm talking to that this is news to them, and disquieting news to them. They're genuinely, first of all, some look at me as if I just made it up. I'm standing there talking to 5 or 10 million people making crap up. Not likely, you know. And not because I have a principled opposition to making things up. I'm an academic, that's what I'm doing. But I'm not going to get caught quite so flat-footed doing that because I'm going to come back and help me. But I can tell that the other person, after looking at my face and realizing I'm probably not making it up, is then very uncomfortable because I hadn't noticed that yet. And I won't embarrass anyone in the room, but let me continue my story. Germany, which is the 3rd or 4th most powerful country in the world today, is governed by a coalition of 2 political parties, the Christian Democrats and the Socialists. That's who runs Germany today. The Prime Minister is a woman who reflects all of this real well. You all know this woman, right? What? Merkel, right? You all know what she was before she became a Christian Democratic politician who's now the Chancellor? She was an East German Communist Party operator. That's what she did for years, okay? And then she danced over, when the unification of Germany happened, as many did, she danced over, and now she is in a coalition government with the socialists. Okay? This is different from an American story, right? Joe Biden doesn't have it. Anyway, the socialists began in Germany to become a political party around the 1870s and 80s. Grew very, very fast, and already by the First World War were the 2nd biggest party in Germany, and they basically stayed as the 2nd biggest party in Germany most of the time since, and they are that today. And in many other countries. So the socialists found themselves in a peculiar situation. They went, by historical standards, pretty quickly from a critique movement, a movement criticizing capitalism, to a movement contesting with parties loyal to capitalism for political power. And when they got into power, they suddenly discovered that they had a serious problem. They could rally people against capitalism to vote them into power. That's what they did. But when they won the elections, they found themselves in a peculiar circumstance. They were an anti-capitalist party, officially, sitting on top of and dependent on capitalists. Because the capitalists either would support the government or they wouldn't. The capitalists had to pay taxes to the government or the government couldn't run. And that plunged, I'm going to make things very simplistic, but it's necessary to make the point for today. That plunged all socialists into an immediate dilemma. Either you run the society and try to do some socialist things, but you work out an accommodation with these capitalists, because if you don't, they're going to really hate you. whatever difficulty you had mobilizing workers to win an election will be as nothing to what will happen to you, or what might happen to you, if these leaders of industry, owners of the wealth, see you as the devil and go to work to undo you. So many, many socialists, through using all kinds of logics, and if you're interested we can talk about it, made that accommodation. They basically said, okay, we're socialists. We were voted in because workers are unhappy about capitalism in various ways. But we don't think it's practical, feasible, possible to kind of just recreate a society. If we try to do that, then these capitalists, the owners of wealth, the runners of enterprise, will destroy us. So if we try to go that way, we will be defeated. And there'll be a bloody confrontation that'll hurt a lot of people, blah, blah, blah. So we can't do that. Even if we'd like to, we can't do it. Or even if we could do it, it's too dangerous to do it, too traumatic. So we're going to work out the following deal. We are going to take the power of the state, which we have won by playing the democratic vote game. We've won, as the socialists did, and as they did in many societies. By the way, such people are winning elections all over Latin America the last few years. Basically, whether it's Chavez or Morales or the others, and in other parts of the world at different times. So they make a deal and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to leave the capitalists alone. That is, they continue to own the wealth. If not all of it, most of it. And countries disagree. Some take a lot and leave a little less for the private. Others barely touch it. Some don't touch it at all. You can keep it, you run the businesses, but we're the government and we're going to put limits on you. We're going to regulate, we're going to control, we're going to hem you around with limitations. And what we're going to focus on are the parts of the socialist program that can be achieved without a direct confrontation with the capitalists. And let me give you some examples from recent socialist countries. You see how that works. Early in the 1980s, a French Socialist Party leader, François Mitterrand was his name, wins an election with the help of the French Communist Party, which was a strong party at that time, much stronger than it is now. But the communists and the socialists work together, and so François Mitterrand, it becomes the socialist premier. By the way, not the first one. There have been other socialist premiers. There's an interesting film playing in New York City right now called Paris 36. You might see it around. It's about an earlier socialist government in France in 1936, a Popular Front, also communist and socialist ally. Anyway, so Mitterrand comes to power, and he's one of these who makes a deal. His deal, you might be interested, it works like this. We, socialists, having won the election with the communists together, we now control the government, and we are going to nationalize, take over, the 10 biggest industrial groups in French capitalism. And they do. The oil companies, the technology company, I don't remember all the steel, automobiles. They already control some of the automobiles, it's more of them. But then to calm things down, Mitterrand said, don't worry, all the rest of French capitalism we won't touch, just the top one, the big ones. And don't worry on the second grounds, because look at the people the French Prime Minister, am going to put in charge of these industries we just took over. And then he proceeded to handpick the top executives of what had been a private company, give him a government title, and put him basically back in the same position, only now he was responsible to the government, although he was doing the same job in the same company. Yeah.
Did the government purchase the shares or something? Or they...
Yes.
Okay.
My recollection that the government purchased. Yes, it would be a more extreme thing to take over.
Yeah,
Yes, absolutely. Although there are examples when that happened. I mean, in Russia in 1917, the Bolshevik leaders basically said to the heads of the old companies, get out of town. And even if they didn't say it, that was the advice that was passed out, and most of them did. Went to Paris, have lived there ever since. No, Mitterrand didn't do that. That would be a more confrontational than he was ready to do. By the way, were there communists and socialists in his government who wanted him to do it? You betcha. And said so loudly. That was a public debate. You could read the news. I was in France at the time. You could read the newspapers, and there would be the debates every day in which the left wing said, no, you should do it, and the right wing said, you can't. This struggle was won, if you like, by the right wing or the center. And so they took over the top there. And then what did socialism come to mean? It didn't mean the end of the capitalist-worker relationship, because in the vast majority of French industry, that really was unchanged. The same private people running board of directors came in the morning, did their thing, and whether it was a little company or a medium company or even a big company. In the very biggest companies, the only thing that changed was the private board of directors that had been elected by shareholders was out, because the government had taken over purchasing it, and so the government nominated the directors instead of them being elected by the shareholders. It's as if the government had become, which it in effect was, the largest shareholder, the dominant shareholder, so it called the tune in terms of electing directors and so forth. So that didn't change. That was an accommodation. And so socialism, by the Socialist Party, came to mean a whole bunch of other things. And let me tell you what they were in France. One of the most dramatic things Mitterrand did is his position on women. Mitterrand is the person who got laws passed which said half of the civil service jobs have to go to women. That's never been done in France before. But it hasn't been done in most countries. If you go to France today, walk down the street and look at the cops. Half the cops are women. Half the firefighters are women. That was the rule. That's it. He passed another law, which, by the way, has remained. Even though the socialists have lost elections and the right wing has come back in, hasn't dared to touch that. Too dangerous for them to touch that. Political parties, I believe the rule in France is still now, since Mitterrand, the party has to put up an equal number of men and women for all elected office. You can't put up, just a rule. If you're going to have, 400 people sitting for parliament, 200 have to be male persons and 200 have to be female persons. He also enhanced educational funding. He improved social services. He begins to do, and he's not the only one, I'm just picking them as an example, to define the socialist response to capitalism in this kind of way. It really isn't about economics all that much. It's about other things. Or at least it's not about production all that much. Here's another thing Mitterrand did, something which, keep in mind, because it may be sneaking up on us here in the United States faster than you might admit. He took over all the banks. Now, most of the banks had already been government banks when he came to power, because France took over the banks after World War II. But he completed the process. Basically, the whole banking system was taken over by the government. And Mitterrand's argument was, we have, now note the language, we have a planned economy now. Very old language for socialism. And the way we're going to do planning is financially. By controlling the banks, we're going to decide who can borrow, how much money, for what purpose. And this gives the government a lot of control over how the economy works, because while we leave all the businesses alone, when the business goes to the bank for the credit it has to get, it's basically dealing with government and a government policy which will determine whether you get some credit and for what you would get credit and on what terms you would get your credit. So it certainly gives the government a powerful influence. But Mitterrand never touched the basic relationship of the worker and the employer in the enterprise. Really important that you understand that. Okay? Even in countries like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and so on, what you had was a more aggressive, if you like, socialist. political takeover, either made possible by an electoral victory or by a revolutionary military kind of effort, an uprising, if you like. And their things went further. This is your question. They often took enterprise. They basically just pushed the old private owner out and said, we're taking this over in the name of the people, or whatever it is they said. And so they would take over, and then they would really change in the sense that all industry in Russia, basically all industry, certainly everything above very tiny things, would become a government enterprise. The government would seize it. The government would put the people in place who ran it, name and control the board of directors. But notice again that in those societies too, with few exceptions, the basic relationship of the worker to the people making the decision remained. The workers still come in the morning at 8 o'clock, use their brains and muscles, help produce a good or a service, and then at 5 o'clock they go home. And they leave behind the fruits of their labor that somebody else disposes of. Their employer, whether that employer be a private corporation or a government enterprise. A matter of importance, I'm not attempting to make you not pay attention to it, but I want you to see something that didn't change rather than something that did. The direct confrontation with the organization of enterprise is avoided. Yeah.
Do you mean they didn't touch the unions or the organization of the employers?
No, they did. They did touch the unions. They changed the unions. But they didn't change the relationship. What I'm after is the relationship between employer and employee. You were, to be as simple as I can, you were one or you were the other. You were one or the other. They still had unions. Now the government and the Communist Party intervened in how these unions function, to be sure. I mean, China today has unions. Russia, the Soviet Union, had trade unions. To get into the actual way they ran their enterprises is quite interesting, but they still had unions. They often added something else. In Russia, they added something called worker councils. The Russian word, so council of workers and so on. So the factory would have a council of workers and a trade union and a Communist Party apparatus. So it's very complicated. The state official, if you want to know, the state official comes in as the member of the board of directors of, say, Company A that makes ball bearings or shirts or whatever in Moscow or Petrograd or wherever. And then this government official has to deal with the workers who have 3 legal institutions that different members of the workers are in. Some are members of the Communist Party. Most usually are not, but many are. Some are members of the Workers' Council that have particular rights. And some are in the trade union. And the trade union has different functions from the Workers' Council, which has a different function from the Communist Party. And then things get even more complicated because members of the directorship are also in the Communist Party that members of the workers are. They're both in the same political party and maybe going to meetings wearing their hat as Communist Party person, even though they're on other sides of the fence. You know, it's a little bit like in a village or a town in the United States, the workers and the bosses go to the same church on Sunday or the same picnic on. And that's an interesting sociological moment when that kind of thing happened. They had that in the Soviet Union too, and they had it in China as well. What I want you to understand is they did not mess around with the basic employer-employee relationship. They thought about it. Lenin, the most important leader of the Soviet Revolution, theoretically and also politically, Lenin was very famous and wrote a lot about this. He understood and made explicit, we can't, was his argument. I'm not arguing he's right, but just so you understand his argument. We can't go further. He made the argument very passionately and very intimately. We just had a big revolution here in 1917. A very tumultuous revolution. It came at the end of a world war that we lost, we Russians. The war devastated us. The Civil War devastated us again. And no sooner did we make a revolution, war devastated us, then the revolution devastated us, and then the reaction to the revolution was the invasion by the United States, France, Britain, and Japan, and the Civil War that was allied with the invasion, the White Army against the Red. I mean, you go from 1914 to basically 1920, 21, 6 or 7 years of cataclysmic civil worldwide, a devastation beyond the words. And Lenin says, we now have come out of all this chaos. We took power, which nobody believed, including them, was possible. But we have it. We got it. And we've actually survived this. Now the number one task we have is to rebuild the economy, because if we don't do it, and if we don't do it fast, the mass of people is going to turn away from us and not allow us to function as a government, because they're so disgusted with the old regime, the czar and everything, that we have a chance here, but we better make good on our claim we can do a better job of feeding people and clothing people, or else we're out of here. And the decision is then made by the Bolshevik self-consciously. If we try to make a revolution inside every enterprise, there goes any chance of getting the production going again. We might like to. It might even be possible in terms of where people's heads are at, but it doesn't work. As I said, we can't do it. So we're going to not do it. And he calls what they do. He calls what they do, the compromise they make. He calls it state capitalism, his phrase. He says we don't have to be worried about state capitalism, that we haven't gotten beyond that, because the workers control the state through the Communist Party and the Bolshevik Revolution. So we have the state, and we can, when the time works, we'll be able to make the further steps we can't make now. Yeah.
What exactly do you mean by they didn't change the relationship between the employees and the employers?
Okay, good question. I'm kind of working my way up to it, but let me continue, but let me answer it in the shorthand way, and then we'll see the connection. One way to organize production is for there to be two groups of people. Those who make the decisions and hire the brokers, and those who do the work. The normal condition of a capitalist enterprise is that these are two different groups of people. For example, the people working in General Motors who make the trucks and the cars and and the board of directors. The board of directors decides what's going to be produced. Those workers do not decide what's to be produced. They decide how it's to be done, what technology is to be used. They decide where it's to be done. Detroit, Mexico, Canada, Panama, wherever else. And finally, and in a way most importantly, they're the ones who get into their hands the revenue and the difference between the revenue and the cost, the profits, and they decide what to do with them. That's their job. Legally, they are the ones to do that job. So that's that's what I mean by a capitalist enterprise. Here's an alternative. There's not two groups of people. There's one. The people who do the work are also the people who make the decision. That's a radically different direction. Now, in the United States, in order to talk about this, and what I do, I have to use words that Americans have warm feelings about. So I describe this as democracy. Americans get all gooey when you talk about democracy. So this is democracy. Well, okay, it's plausible. It gets at the idea. It's that workers are going to be their own board of directors. If you read, just for the historical record, if you read those sections where both Marx and subsequent Marxists have actually tried to talk about the linkage, the implications of Marx's critique of capitalism in terms of what it is he proposes as an alternative, then that's it. He uses phrase like the associated worker, or the workers in an association, or the community of workers, right? The word communism and the word community have the same root. It's the idea of the collective, the commune, the community. And the idea is the workers can run the machinery, operate the business as a community. They do not have to have other people, not themselves, making those decisions. That's not, for those of you for whom this might matter, it is nowhere in the Bible that it has to be the one or the other way. I doubt it's in the Quran, I'm no expert, but it isn't. So the idea is here, and an idea that has been very deep and powerful in the history of the socialist and communist movements, that's what it's about. Yeah.
But aren't you also then just creating an elite class within the party? I mean, because either way you have a segregation. You need people to manage and people to do the work. You can't really do both.
That's a question. That's a position. I understand that position. But that's all it is. It's a position. But there's the alternative position. That's the only point I want you to get. There's the alternative position. You don't need it.
You don't need a manager. Everyone figures it out collectively what they're going to do.
Sure.
And then they enforce it on each other?
Yes. Exactly.
It rotates.
Yeah.
What?
He just said it.
What did you say?
Rotation.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
That's in the old socialist literature, which I can see from your faces, you would probably be interested in, and which has been withheld from you, because it's all there. Books and articles, hundreds, thousands of them, in all languages. Rotation has always been an idea. If, for example, that's been one of, in the argument between what you just said and the alternative I'm posing, one of the attempts to resolve it is, okay, let's have a compromise. Somebody has to kind of be the coordinator or the supervisor, something, but to avoid what happens in capitalism, we shouldn't cement people in the either or. So in order to make the by the way, this is an old idea. In order to make the supervisor good at his or her job, it's crucial that they also be the supervised and vice versa. That your very capacity to do the job will be better if you are not fixed into the one or the other position. Marx wrote it this way. He said, if you have this separation, there will be a cultural and intellectual division between what he liked to call mental and manual labor. What you're going to do is you're going to fix some people in a job that is 99% one and 1% the other, and another group of people, vice versa. And this is very bad. It atrophies in the one what they're not doing, as it atrophies in the other what they're not doing, makes people different, makes people hostile, makes people incomprehending of one another, suspicious. You don't need to be a socialist or a communist to get this. Because in most modern religious movements, this stuff is all floating around there. Jesus and his disciples. If you play the game and you look, you'll see that this issue, what you just raised, and this has been done in human society, this conflict, this set of alternatives, have been struggled with for a long, long time. Here in the United States, one of the first Americans there ever were had an arrangement in which they didn't have supervisors. If you study the Iroquois, before the Americans come here, and you study how they organized the multiple tribes, the Mohawks and the others that comprise the large Iroquois nation, you will discover that they had this all worked out, and had it worked out for hundreds of years. There were no supervisors supervising this. They didn't do that. They didn't handle their and they had all the production problems with their animals and with the vegetables they raised and all the rest of it. They also did things that modern human beings think of having to do with socialist ways of, for example, family organization. The Iroquois raised all children as collectives. Often didn't know who the particular parent was. Thought, to quote a famous woman, it takes a village to raise the child. This is a very, I don't want to take anything away from Mrs. Quinn. I don't mind taking things away. I don't want. But she didn't invent this. She just mouths it again. This is a very old idea that human beings might be better off if the children were raised in a community rather than being dependent on the accident of which two persons did something. half aware of what they were doing and utterly unaware of what they were getting into. Right? And then now the little child emerges and is stuck with these two, upon whom it depends in ways that are marking all of us for a long, long life.